Hello and a very warm welcome. You're watching Discussion Today with your host, Kriti Mishra. The Finance Ministry, in its monthly economic review for December, said that while the global economic recovery has been hit by a second wave of infections and more stringent lockdowns in several countries, India's economy is riding against the COVID-19 wave with persistent improvements in economic indicators showing a V-shaped recovery. The World Bank, in its Global Economic Prospects report, has projected a growth of 4% in the global economy in 2021, and in India, growth is expected to recover to 5.4% in 2021. And to track India's economic progress, I'm joined by Mr. A.S. Bhal, former Principal Economic Advisor to Government of India, and Mr. Abhinav Prakash, Assistant Professor of Economics, University of Delhi. Welcome to Rajya Sabha Television, gentlemen. Mr. Bhal, coming to you first. Let me quote a phrase from this report. The effective management of COVID-19 spread despite the festive season and onset of winter season, combined with sustained improvement in high-frequency indicators and V-shaped recovery along with easing of lockdown restrictions, distinguish Indian economy as one riding against the COVID wave. Your thoughts, sir?
So this monthly report, which is being brought out by Ministry of Finance, Department of Economic Affairs, actually sums up the entire situation very well. I mean, as we all know, the overriding problem has been the corona epidemic, and everything, the ups and downs of the global and the Indian economy have been determined by it over the last 5-6 months. Now, thanks to some very adept management of the corona epidemic, and thanks to some very welcome signals coming on the vaccination front, both globally and in India, the entire mood of the economy is upbeat. And that is reflected in the high frequency indicators, the purchasing the PMI index for manufacturers, the railway freight movement, the non-food credit, all of that are on an upswing. So, and as the travel and hospitality industry will also tell us, during the end of December, there was a lot of travel by tourists. There were a lot of occupancy in the hotels. And the automobile sector is telling us that the number of registrations in December have finally gone on a positive mood after 5-6 months. So overall, a big sort of, with some caveats, a thumbs up for the economy. And we are all hoping that with the coming in of the vaccine, India will really sort of, the trajectory of growth will go on a big boost.
Yeah. Absolutely, sir. You mentioned about vaccine. Mr. Prakash, the approval for long-awaited vaccine lends optimism to both the health as well as the economic indicators. According to you, the impact of rollout of vaccination and increased mobility on India's economic recovery?
Well, thank you, Kirti ji. First of all, we have to understand that India's response to the pandemic was very well calibrated. It was very well thought of. So when the pandemic began in the March, we had no idea about the nature of the disease. No one had any idea as to how the situation would unfold. So what we did, we simply hedged against the worst by imposing a lockdown, a major lockdown not seen outside China. And then we basically hedged against the worst of the problem. And then we supplemented that by giving economic packages to the most vulnerable sections of society, like rolling out the world's largest food aid program and liquidity support to our small and medium enterprises. And since then, we have been unlocking step by step and supplementing that with a major financial reform, a major economic reform. We have completely reformed our economic system. This is the biggest reform after 1991. And then we are then coming up medium-sized packages to the economy. So instead of wasting of all our physical space in a one-time mega physical stimulus program during the lockdown, which would have gone nowhere, as the experience of the Europe and America is now showing us, we basically focused on building resilience and building flexibility. And now with the rolling out of the vaccine, which is just around the corner, I think the situation will become much better, because once the vaccine is out, then all the restrictions on the economy imposed due to the pandemic will be removed. And then we can really expect a sharp economic recovery, which is already underway. So the point is that we took a very well thought, very calibrated effort, focused on building resilience, because in March we had no idea how it will be unfold. We did not have the capacity, we did not have the hospitals. So we took that time to build capacity in the healthcare sector. Now with the vaccine, when you combine that together, I think we are looking at a very bright future going forward.
You're pointing towards a V-shaped recovery. Mr. Bhal, as you're seeing, green shoots are visible across sectors. We also saw record high GST collections. Your assessment of economic growth ahead?
Just to put things in perspective, as we all know, in the first quarter till June, we did very badly with minus 23.9%. And the second quarter, we did much better. The second quarter was much better. And now, hopefully, in the third quarter, we'll really do much better. Even the World Bank, in their assessment, as you said, have said that the Indian economy will be growing by about 5.4% in the year 2021. And the GST collections is a very sort of, flagship indicator of the state of the industrial growth in the economy. So it showed a very robust growth of, it showed about 1.15 lakh crore, which is a very good sign showing that the economy is bouncing back and the firms are doing what they have to do. The people are buying, and the entire chain of inputs getting into outputs and then input tax credit, all of that is falling into place, and the Indian economy is on the sort of uphill trajectory. So that GST figure of, is a really sort of landmark figure, which tells you in a nutshell, it's a leading indicator of the economy. It tells you in a nutshell that sort of all's going well, and in the future, the manufacturing, the industry, the sales all will sort of pick up, and we'll go along on a very healthy trajectory. Thank you.
But talking about the challenges, Mr. Prakash, there are downside risks. The spread of UK mutant virus. Then there are concerns about fatigue from the social distancing norms. And even in the World Bank report, there are concerns on decrease in private household spending or private investment for that matter. How do we address those concerns?
Well, while this is true that the pandemic is far from over and we have this new strain of virus which is now spreading across the world, and this is the nature of any pandemic, you have repeated waves of the pandemic, and the virus also mutates and evolves over time. So I think this uncertainty is the biggest factor which poses a threat to the economic recovery, because remember, even if you have, let's say, even if you have wrong policies in place, but people are certain about those policies, the economy does well. But even if you have, disruptions, if you have uncertainty about the future, that everyone tries to hedge, and you do not have the economic optimism in place, and investments also decline. So that is a big problem. But I think with the arrival or the rollout of the vaccine, we are going to overcome this new strain as well, because anyways, if you develop antibodies, then perhaps it will also work for the new strain of the virus. But the question here will be the physical cost of rollout of the vaccine. So the health ministry has set aside around 50,000 crore for the vaccination of the entire country. To put that into perspective, our total health spending by both center and the state is 200,000 crore rupees. So it's a huge amount that will put a huge burden on the fiscal exchequer. The other point is that there is a decline in the spending by the private sector. And that is true because the incomes have fallen because of the lockdown. So once you have the minus 24% a negative growth rate, of course, that will show up in the purchasing power of the people. And not just the incomes have fallen, lots of people did lose their job. And those who didn't lose their job, their salaries have been reduced. So that is a demand side problem, which will have to be taken into account, and that can only be improved upon once we have a fast-paced recovery. So there's no alternative to do that. You can't just give salaries once you do not have good economic growth rate. But I think going forward, as the economic recovery picks pace, that is going to improve on its own. But as far as the private businesses are concerned, I think they are still facing lots of problems, because one thing is the uncertainty. They don't know how the things will roll out in the future. There's lots of rumor mongering that the second lockdown can be imposed, or those kind of, at the local level, you see, the local administration is quite erratic in that sense. So they are coming up with arbitrary rules. We have seen that over the last 1 year. And the other problem which they are facing is the shortage of the demand. So the private sector is going to produce commodities or invest in expansion of the capacity when they are assured of the future demand. So I think these both things have to be taken into account. And the government's steps to provide liquidity support, to provide other kind of support, and also to provide support them by these supply side reforms, I think that will go a long way. Another thing which has happened, and we have learned that lesson, is that in Maharashtra they reduced the stamp duty on the new houses being bought. And that has actually increased the revenue of the Maharashtra government. So it basically tells you, it's a classic Laffer curve at play, that reduce your taxation, reduce your all duties on the supply side, and you will definitely see a positive impact on the economic growth rate as well, and also on the government's revenue.
But Mr. Prakash, you made a very important point there about fiscal burden. And let me take that to Mr. Bhal. Mr. Bhal, the government has been saying that fiscal worries can wait, economic recovery and economic growth cannot. Your take, sir?
So there's globally now, there's a feeling in macroeconomics that too much is being made of this fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP. Even developed countries like the US and Europe have sort of coming around to the view that as long as you're spending the money in a productive manner, the fiscal deficit can sort of be put in the sort of backwaters. I mean, the earlier scare which the International Monetary Fund used to put on developing economies, that you have to follow this band of very narrow fiscal deficit, otherwise, it will lead to inflation and unemployment, what have you. That's been given a go by with a lot of major economists all over the world. And we're all coming around to the view that, all right, fiscal deficit is important, but it's not the sort of be all and end all. That money has to be used, and you can sometimes, produce more money, and then as long as you're using it for productive purposes, as in this case, as Abhinav was saying, you're using it to sort of prop up demand and improve your supply. I mean, giving too much of a scare through fiscal deficit is not on, and that is what the current thinking is, not only in India but globally also.
Mr. Prakash, do you agree?
Well, I fully agree to that. You see, this 3% fiscal deficit target under the FRBM is an arbitrary number. There's no reason why the fiscal deficit has to be 3%. It can't be. It can easily be 5%. Can easily be 6%. It should depend upon your macroeconomic situation. It should depend upon your capacity to spend, and it should also be determined by your economic goals going forward in the future. And also on the side of the inflation, this excessive focus on this inflation targeting is also counterproductive, because remember, whenever you will have higher economic growth rate, the inflation will rise. So we are, by keeping the inflation low, we are somehow compromising with the economic growth rate and the high rate of employment. So this very narrow band of inflation targeting needs to be re-looked at, and I think it's an ongoing discussion in the field of economics. Many economists are pointing out that inflation targeting is not a very good thing to do in such a strict manner. We should have more flexible inflation targeting, which should allow for the inflation to rise and also the fiscal deficit to rise. Because remember, India is a economy where aggregate demand has always been a problem since the beginning. And one of the major drivers of demand has been the government spending. So if you're curtailing the government spending itself, then you are really compromising on the economic growth rate. So I fully agree with what Anandji is saying here.
Well, absolutely. And now let's move on and discuss about specific sectors. Mr. Bhal, in the report, the ministry also picked out the agriculture sector as one which remains the bright spot of Indian economy, with a growth of 2.9% in winter sowing, accelerating tractor sales and increase in reservoirs storage at 122% over the decade's average. Road to recovery for rural India, sir.
That's true. Going back by the corona pandemic, agriculture was the one sector which was the least affected by the corona pandemic. The farming activities were going on as it was, without being sort of put into a tight corner like the industry and services sector. So agriculture has been a sort of a flagship performer during the last 6-7 months. Essentially, largely also because the pandemic didn't affect it in as virulent a manner as it did the other sectors. And despite the sort of, without getting into the merits of this new sort of batch of agricultural laws and thing, what have you, overall the situation in agriculture is definitely improving. It is, and as our chief economic advisor, my boss earlier used to say, Raghuram Rajan, the best way to help agriculture in a way is to get people out of agriculture. The only major problem in agriculture. We see that too many people in agriculture, and they have to be gradually, as the economy develops, they have to move into manufacturing and services, into low-skilled jobs, and then into higher-skilled jobs. Because we have a fixed plot of land, and there are economies of scale. If you make it too small, then ultimately the farmers don't get their sort of due rights. So agriculture is overall doing well. Technology hubs are people who help with the seeds and fertilizers are doing well. And keeping my fingers crossed, once this problem regarding agricultural reforms in the present context gets resolved, I'm sure agriculture will sort of provide a very resilient and robust way out. Because as it is, about 50% of our people are still dependent on agriculture, and there's no getting away from it. For India to do well, agriculture has to do well. There's absolutely no two ways about it. It provides about only 16% of our GDP, but about 50% of people are dependent on it. So obviously the per capita income is not as high as it would be. And there is one thing, in my opinion, gradually the agriculture sector sort of has to use less labor, and people have to sort of gradually learn to move out of agriculture to manufacturing and services. Thank you.
And as the report says, that agriculture sector was a bright spot in this gloom. But talking about the manufacturing sector, Mr. Prakash, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has given a clarion call for Atmanirbhar Bharat. We've also seen that the PLI scheme has been extended to 10 more sectors. Prime Minister also made a very important statement saying that today's startups are MNCs of tomorrow, and this decade is going to be MNCs of India. The road ahead for the manufacturing sector.
Well, this is true. This Atmanirbhar Bharat is a very ambitious scheme because it envisions that India should now become integrated to the global supply chains. So this Atmanirbhar Bharat is not that isolationist policy of 60s and the 70s. This is basically making India part of the global value chains, because production process today is very much fragmented. You have different parts being produced in different countries. So you should emerge as a country which can capture, that global supply chain and become part of it. So in that sense, this scheme is quite ambitious and quite welcome. And also this PLI scheme has been quite successful in the case of the mobile manufacturing, mobile assembly to be very sure. And we are now extending that to other sectors like automobile, pharmaceuticals. So I think going forward, that will also yield good result. But the other problem of the manufacturing sector is the lack of, high quality labor in India. So while we have cheap labor in India, we do not have skilled labor in India. And remember, the quality control is not just the function of your managerial supervision, but also is the function of the skill of the labor. So that is where we need to invest going forward. So the labor reforms are a good thing, but we also need to invest massively in the basic education and also in the training of the labor. And also coming to the agriculture sector, so you have these farm reforms, these new farm bills. If you combine that with the labor reforms, I think we're looking forward to the positive impact in the agro business, right? So these food processing industries and different industries which are very labor intensive. So you combine the entry of the corporates and the farm laws in the agriculture sector with the labor reforms. I think we're looking forward to a very positive expansion of the agro business in this country. But the last point is that ultimately, it will also depend upon your aggregate demand in the country, because your startups can scale up, once they capture the domestic market. So by catering to a large market in India, they can achieve economies of scale, efficiency, product improvement, innovation. Then they can go and compete out in the world. But I think this is a beginning, and we should start the next new decade with an optimistic note.
But you made a very legit point there about skill development. Mr. Bhal, skill development still remains a challenge. How do we address that?
Skill development, a lot has been done on skill development since this government came to power in 2014, and the Prime Minister himself, had set a very ambitious target of about 50 million people being skilled. So National Skill Development Commission was set up, and a lot of work has been done on it. But obviously, skill development and placing those skilled people on the ground is not an easy task. Firstly, you have to develop quality standards, you have to have certifying bodies, and then you have to find ultimately jobs for them. So the skill set which the workers are trained in will have to match with the requirements of the industry. So that's one thing people are taking very seriously, and the efforts to scale it up. If you go to any city and if you look for a good plumber, it's very difficult to find.
Yes.
It'll depend on which side of the bed you got up in the morning. It's very difficult to find a skilled plumber. Now it's the job of the skills agencies to to firstly train the gentleman, to certify him, and then put it on a public platform. Okay, this is the person, he's got A-level certification. So this entire ecosystem of skills, a lot of work is going on it. Ministry of Skills and Entrepreneurship has been set up. They've taken in all the skills which were being done, 40 odd skilling programs being done by 18 ministries. Now they've come under one head of the skills ministry. And I know for sure with a lot of colleagues working there, the National Council for Vocational Training has been set up. So you see that getting the ecosystem into place, and it's a long and arduous path, but we are getting there. We are certainly getting there, is what
Absolutely,
I can say
sir.
at the moment.
We are certainly getting there. But before we end this conversation, the United Nations says that India could be the most resilient economy in the sub-region of South and Southwest Asia. Closing comments from both my guests on global sense on Indian recovery and Indian economy. Mr. Prakash.
Well, I think that is true because if you see at the Western countries, the advanced economies, they are very badly hit by the pandemic, and their response to the pandemic has been suboptimal, to say, right? So we have seen what is happening in America. We've seen what is happening in Europe. Many countries in Europe did not go for the lockdown, and now they are paying a heavy price. So these are advanced economies where, the pandemic, the disruption has played a very devastating role. But India has been somehow being spared by that kind of devastation, basically because of, prompt government response, and also because I think our immunity levels are too high because we're used to facing these viruses and disease every year. Every year in Delhi you have dengue. So we have some kind of resilience, it seems. And I think going forward, India, if it gets to play its cards right and supplement that with the much needed reforms, like a major reform in the country which is required is the judicial reform. If we can only implement judicial reforms, I think Economic Survey 2 years back basically said that we will gain around 1% of GDP growth rate. Because, the contract enforcement, the law and order, the judicial reform, and the judicial arbitrariness in giving out judgment on economic issues, if that can be taken care of, I think we will not be only resilient, but also the bright spot in the world economy in the coming years.
Mr. Bhal?
The Indian economy, if I may, just to add a sort of touch of glamour to it, it's almost like a jewel in the crown in the world. You see this huge market which we have, this huge supply of labor. Of course, they need to be skilled, and the infrastructure in place, the healthy and vibrant democracy. Which other country in the world will offer you this? So no wonder global investors, are sort of making a sort of beeline to this place. The foreign direct investment is going up. Of course, the ease of doing business has to sort of improve more in India, but we are really strongly struggling with that, and the government is really sort of dotting the I's and crossing the T's. So I would say that India is sort of in the 21st century, as it is, we are the 5th largest economy in the world. We'll go up and up, this healthy democracy, these big markets, the highly entrepreneurial people, it just needs, we are at an inflection point in the economy. And with this artificial intelligence, digitization, that's our strength. And the 4th industrial revolution coming in, all these things, I see a very bright future for India. And I'm sure all my colleagues and Mr. Abhinav, Prakash will also agree to that. Thank you.
Well, absolutely, sir. And let me borrow that phrase from you. The Indian economy is the jewel in the crown of the world. On that sanguine note, thank you so much for joining us on this discussion. So that's all we have for you in discussion today. Thanks for watching and stay tuned to Rajya Sabha TV.